Welcome to Presently Presents.
You need quite a wide range of skills because we play music, but you've got to be able to do the speech and the journalism side of things. Not on every show, but certainly on the breakfast show. Because over the years, I've been lucky enough to get the chance to cover speech shows with a lot of current affairs and news and journalism in. I've been able to kind of magpie lots of different bits and acquire lots of different bits of experience and hopefully lots of different skills so I can do a bit of everything.
Today's Presently Presents guest is a BBC local radio presenter who hosts The Breakfast Show on BBC Radio Bristol. Starting off as a broadcast assistant nearly 10 years ago, he's worked his way up within BBC local radio in Bristol and Somerset to now hosting the coveted Breakfast Show for the last couple of years. He's interviewed the Prime Minister, which went viral on social media with his colleagues, actually won a broadcasting award. He's covered the death of Queen Elizabeth II, was a familiar, friendly face, or voice, I suppose, to listeners throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, and more recently completed a 24-hour walk and talkathon, all in aid of BBC Children in Need. So today's Presently Presents guest is James Hanson. James, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Esme. Great to be here.
Now, do you want to start us off? As I said, you've been doing, you've been in radio for kind of coming up to 10 years, according to your LinkedIn. So hoping that's accurate.
It is up to date. I did write it, yeah.
Perfect. So what made you want to get into radio in the first place? Has it been something you've always loved, or was it something you kind of fell into?
Yeah, I was one of those strange children who used to sit in my bedroom pretending to be on the radio, and in the summer holidays, I would literally sit behind my computer and pretend I was a DJ, and I would play songs off my computer. And you know the caps lock key, when you hit it, the green light comes on. I pretended that was my microphone. So if the green light was on the caps lock key, that was my microphone. And I used to practice talking up the vocals of the songs and then hit my microphone off. And I wasn't recording it, thankfully, because that would have sounded dreadful. But I just did it for the fun of it. Genuinely, that was my idea of a good time. And thankfully, I managed to turn that into a career. Obviously doing sort of student radio, community radio along the way to help me gain that experience. But yeah, I sort of always did want to be on the radio, really. So, which is actually not unusual with a lot of radio presenters. Quite a few people know from an early age they want to do it. But having said that, there are also lots of people who maybe later in life or later in their career, having done something else, think, oh yeah, radio, or they fall into, and that's a really great route into the industry as well.
Oh, that's really cute. I like the idea of like little baby James doing his pretend radio shows.
It was baby James, yes.
Baby James. What did you study at university? Was it related or was it random?
No, I did politics at the University of Leeds, only because I thought, well, if the media thing doesn't come off, then I need something else. And obviously politics is not unhelpful because, as you mentioned, you know, we have to cover politics, interview the Prime Minister last year and that kind of stuff. So having an awareness of current affairs definitely does help. But one of the reasons I chose to go to Leeds Uni is I knew they had a very good student radio station. So even then, that was a factor in my decision. I thought I want to do student radio. Mm-hmm. I did loads of student radio when I was there, all kinds of shows, ended up on the committee, kind of helping to run the station. So I loved all of that side of things. But yeah, I mean, I know loads of my friends and colleagues who have gone into radio did like journalism or did like a media course. And those are really good ways of gaining the skills. But I kind of gained the skills through student radio, really.
Oh, I love that. So I said, you know, in my intro that you started off as a broadcast assistant, which I know a lot of people do, especially within local radio. Do you want to talk us through kind of what that involves as a job?
Yeah, well, basically, it's a bit of a dog's bodies role, but that's sort of the point, and it's really invaluable experience. It's everything from answering the phones, making cups of tea, meeting and greeting guests, but also it can be all the way through to reading the travel news, almost being a co-presenter. Even presenting a show on your own. You know, when I was still a broadcast assistant, I was given the chance to cover a few shows, which is not uncommon. And it's a really good way of just building skills and experience. And these days within the BBC, they call them journalism coordinators, as the technical term. They rebranded them. Basically it's the same thing. And it's a really great way to get into the industry. And I was lucky enough that I did it at BBC Radio Somerset, which is pretty much the smallest, with the exception of Jersey and Guernsey, of the BBC local radio stations, which when you're new, it's perfect because they haven't got many staff. And if you're half decent, they will give you stuff to do. So within a year, I was presenting, news reading, producing, just because they needed people to help out. It was all hands on deck, wasn't that I was particularly good. It's just they needed people to help out, but it gained me that experience. So I was very lucky in that sense. But yeah, broadcast assistant is a classic way into particularly the BBC.
That's kind of amazing as well that they give you, because you kind of think there must be so many people who want to be a radio presenter. There's so many people who will be desperate for the jobs, but you're saying that they literally can just kind of go, oh, go on, have a go almost, which is so strange to think, isn't it?
And every radio station will be different. You know, if you're working at a big commercial station or a national station, you maybe won't get the same opportunities as if you're, you know, a junior member of staff at a BBC local radio station. And even within BBC local radio, if you're at one of the big city stations, there may be fewer opportunities to do as much on air as maybe at one of the small ones. But there are still opportunities. And the key thing is it's a great way of making contacts, building experience, building your own confidence as well, because that can be a thing when you start out. You think, well, am I good enough? Am I going to get found out? Yeah. And actually realising, you know, you're not rubbish and you've got something here. That can be really important. And and I think, you know, there are some people who might think, okay, it's not necessarily the dream when you're starting out. You know, I was a bit like, oh, I'd love to just apply for a job, be a presenter straight away and straight in. And for some people, it works out like that. But for a lot of people, it doesn't. And actually gaining those other skills and kind of working your way up a bit more, sometimes in the long run, you become a better presenter for that.
Yeah. Yeah. And so after you did your broadcast assistant, you went into journalism. Do you think it's quite easy to progress within radio? Like, because there kind of feels like a bit of a set path that a lot of people seem to do. So would you say it's quite easy, or am I making it sound easier than it is?
No, I think it depends. Within BBC local radio, it's not an uncommon sort of progression to go from being a broadcast assistant or a journalism coordinator these days to a journalist. So then you do officially like a reporter. And even though you probably have done a lot of reporting anyway as a broadcast assistant, you're officially a reporter, newsreader, producer, whatever it may be. And it's sort of a rank up, as it were. But I mean, I think that I've got no formal journalism training. You know, I did politics at uni, I did student radio, but I didn't ever do a journalism course or anything. And a lot of journalists who work within BBC local radio, or indeed for any other radio station, have had that route. And there's a lot to be said for going to a journalism school and doing a broadcast journalism course. But I don't think it's essential. You know, the key thing is that you understand how to put together a report, that you understand the basics of journalism, and that you're interested in the story. It's just, are you curious? Are you interested, really? Can you relate it? And sometimes you've got people who've been through, you know, a journalist school, and they've got, on one level, a journalist instincts, but they haven't got the broadcast skills to communicate it. And being a broadcast journalist, if you can't communicate it, nothing else matters. It's about telling the story. And sometimes you've got to do it as simply as possible. You know, the skill with broadcast journalism is taking what at times can be very complicated, difficult stories and making them simple. You know, deciding which details the audience don't need to know about because they're irrelevant. You know, what is the key thing that the listener or the viewer needs to know? And I think that just comes from instinct and experience and, you know, learning from people around you. And I've been lucky to work with some really good colleagues who have kind of, you know, guided me along the way. And when I made the transition from being a broadcast assistant to a broadcast journalist, at first I was a bit like, oh, you know, do I really know what I'm doing? But again, it's that experience, learning from people, it's listening. And people also want you to succeed. You know, if you're a nice person and you're a good colleague to work with, people will help you and help you develop as well. Yeah.
And what was your kind of transition then from broadcast journalist into presenter? How did that, because I know you've done a bit of covering and stuff like that. What was the step like to get that opportunity?
Yeah. It was interesting anyway, because I mean, I always knew from the get-go when I joined BBC, first at BBC Radio Somerset, then Radio Bristol, that I wanted to present. That was always my ambition. Going back to being baby James in my bedroom, that's what I was doing, and that's what I wanted to do. So, you know, not that long of being at Somerset, I said to the boss, look, if there's ever any opportunity to do any cover presenting, even if it's at, you know, 2:00 in the morning on a Sunday, let me know. I'd love to do it. And they were lucky enough I was lucky enough to give them the chance to do a couple of weekend shows covering, and then given the chance to kind of cover other shows during the week and whatever. And by the time I moved to BBC Radio Bristol as a journalist, as a reporter, again, I was lucky enough to be given the chance to do more covering. And then probably about 18 months into my time at Radio Bristol, a weekend show became available. The presenters left and they said to me, do you want to do, it was only an hour on a Saturday lunchtime to begin with, 12 until 1. Do you want to do it? It can be your show. obviously I jumped at the opportunity. I loved it. And then that became 2 hours, and then it got moved to Saturday morning. Then I did Saturday evenings for a time during the pandemic, and then the breakfast show came up, and I was offered that, really. So, it's just that kind of progression. Every time a new opportunity comes up, jump at it, go for it, try and prove your versatility, and certainly, there are so many different types of radio presenter, whether you're on a speech station, music station, what kind of music do you play, who are you targeting. BBC Local Radio is a funny beast in the sense that you're kind of, you need quite a wide range of skills, because we play music, but you've got to be able to do the speech and the journalism side of things. Not on every show, but certainly on the breakfast show. And so, because over the years I've been lucky enough to get the chance to cover speech shows with a lot of current affairs and news and journalism in them, but also, my Saturday show was a bit daft. I used to have comedy characters and sketches and play loads of music, and it was just kind of like a entertainment show, basically, that I've been able to kind of magpie lots of different bits and acquire lots of different bits of experience and hopefully lots of different skills, so I can do a bit of everything. Jack of all trades, master of none, I suppose. But that, in a way, is sometimes what you need in the industry.
Yeah, and when you say that you got offered the breakfast show, was it as easy as that? They were like, James, let's have a meeting, the breakfast show's available, do you want it? Or did you have to audition for it? Or how was there lots of people I'm guessing other people wanted it within the stations?
Well, it was funny, really, because it was the previous presenter who'd been a great mentor of mine, a woman called Emma Britton, who had been doing the breakfast show at BBC Radio Somerset when I joined, and then left to do the breakfast show at Radio Bristol just before I left to go and report at Radio Bristol. It's almost like I was copying her career path.
Following her.
But yeah, pretty much. But she was brilliant, and I hugely admired her as a presenter, and I'm still in touch with her. She's a good friend of mine, and she left of her own accord because she wanted to do something completely different, and I always thought there's a chance I could be offered it, because I was at that point the regular cover presenter, and there is a sort of unwritten rule in radio that very often the cover presenter never gets it. Like, whoever the stand-in is never ends up getting it. They'll go for someone else. So part of me thought, well, am I going to guess or not? But I thought, well, I'm in with a shout. And when she did then leave, they said to me, well, do you want to do it on like an interim basis? We're going to review options, see what we think. Do you want to take it on? So I'm like, okay.
Was the pressure quite a lot on then? Because you had to they're kind of listening out, aren't they? They're testing to see how you get on.
Sort of, because you kind of think, well, like, how long is this interim period going to last? Is this like 10 weeks?
Indefinite.
Is this 6 months? And basically, here we are 2.5 years later, and okay, it's my show now, but officially, nothing really has ever happened in the interim. They just haven't taken me off yet. So, yeah, exactly. So it'll happen one day.
One day they'll turn to you and say, James, your interim's finished now. We finally found a presenter 2 years later.
Yeah, exactly. We'll sort it. So, no, it's funny. I think it's that classic thing of some people, they work somewhere, they get their foot in the door and they never leave type thing. And that's a bit like me with the breakfast show, really. And in any radio station, the breakfast show is always kind of the show you want to do, because it traditionally gets the biggest audience. And whether I do any other breakfast shows again in the future, the fact that I'm able to say I've done a breakfast show on my home city station will always be something I'm really proud of. I love doing it. So, but yeah, it was funny because it wasn't as simple as, okay, here's the breakfast show, it's all yours. And to begin with, when you take over a show, you do have a certain license to make lots of changes to it. But when you're kind of, okay, well, you're only doing it for the time being, and then we'll review options. At first, we made some changes, but not maybe as many as I would want, because I didn't feel I necessarily had the license to kind of go, right, I'm ripping up the entire show and doing my own thing, because, it wasn't like, yeah, here's a 3-year contract, do it as you want type thing. So, but over time we have, evolved the show, and just, not because there's anything wrong with it before I did it, but every format, every kind of show suits a different presenter differently, and you've got to kind of mould it in your image. Certain things will suit certain presenters better, and so that's what we've tried to do, really.
Yeah, and also I always think as well with you. I mean, as you know, it's my home station as well. My home. I don't live in Bristol anymore, but it is my home. And in terms of I think there's a stereotypical BBC Local Radio presenter, isn't there, in terms of what you picture in your mind. You're quite young to be doing the breakfast show, I think. Maybe you disagree, but I think if you was quite a young presenter, would you say so?
Yeah, I mean, I'm 30. I took over the breakfast show when I was 28. You know, in the grand scheme of things, that is younger for a BBC local radio presenter. And yeah, I was really lucky to get those opportunities at that age. But I think, you know, it's partly just being in the right place at the right time. I've been lucky enough to be with the BBC for quite a long time. So, you know, I've been with the BBC now for 9 years because I basically left straight out of uni at the age of 21, which meant that for my age, I'd built up quite a lot of experience within the BBC. And I think the other thing with local radio, if you are younger, and there are loads of young people in local radio, understandably, because it's a great way into the industry, and you know, you need young people who have passion and creativity and new ideas. You don't want a load of people who have been there for 40 years. I mean, there are some great veterans of local radio who are proper, like, you know, icons of their local radio station. But if you have everyone been there for 40 years, there's a danger it becomes stale. Yeah. The flip side of that is, I think if you are a bit younger, particularly given we have on average an older audience, you have to have a kind of cultural have to know the cultural references from decades past, as it were. You know, if you go straight on air and you're talking about, oh, I've seen this on TikTok or whatever, like, you know, that can work. But if that's all you do, then you know, that might alienate part of your audience. You know, if you don't know loads about the music of the 70s and the 80s, but you're playing it, that can be an issue. And I've always been, despite the fact I'm relatively young, a bit of an old soul in a way. Like, I love, my favourite music is like disco, funk and soul from the 70s. I love all that kind of stuff. You know, show me a classic 80s sitcom and I'm happy. You know, I've all, in terms of like having the cultural references from yesteryear, I'm kind of like an old man trapped in a young man's body. So in a way, BBC Local Radio suits me quite well.
I love 80s music, so I can relate in a way. And just again, back to your sort of early days. Now, your brother is also in the media industry, which I think is quite unusual to have both siblings doing, you know, really cool things in media. Did you come from like a media household? And for people who don't know, your brother has a podcast which is very popular as well, your brother's podcast, and you are referenced on that podcast. You know, I've told you, I know, you know, I listened to it, and you're, as well, your name is James Whippety Woo Hanson on that podcast, which I did hear
Jordan's impression the other day. Yes.
So you're not from a media background, or?
No, Mum used to work in retail. Dad is a chartered surveyor, so basically a glorified estate agent. And no, neither of them have any media background. And you know, I don't know what it is. I think, you know, both William, my brother, and I have always. I mean, we used to growing up. I mean, he would sometimes play radio stations with me. Occasionally, he would deign me with his presence and be my co-presenter, or he would often be doing like little TV shows and stuff in the back garden, and he'd rope me in and all that kind of stuff. So, from a young age, we were kind of media-minded for whatever reason. I don't think we necessarily thought, oh, we'll both go on to do it. And, you know, he's had an unusual route in, I suppose, because he's really an etiquette expert, I suppose, would be his proper job description. So random. I mean, how on earth does anyone be an etiquette expert? And then the podcast is hilarious and now one of the successful podcasts in the country. And obviously does with Jordan from Radio 1. And, you know, they're great mates and they're a great partnership. And, yeah, it is funny, but I think... You know, I think it's just like-minded people, really. You know, we're obviously alike on one level, even though superficially we're very different. We do have similarities, and it's in the same way that I'm sure with you, Esme, you've got loads of friends who work in the media because that's kind of where you work and that's what you do. You know, you're attracted to people who have similar interests to you, and so it's funny, but no, we had no real media sort of heritage in the family as such. We both just found our way into it.
Yeah, I mean, and for those who don't know, because William does the podcast Help I Sex Is My Boss, which is, like, as you said, really super popular, and James has mentioned on it a lot. So if you want to hear Jordan's impression of James, you can definitely look that up. It's a great podcast. But yeah, you are.
It's not quite as good as his impression of my mum, but it's. No,
is that accurate? Is it an accurate impression of your mum?
No,
or is it
it's not. It's not an accurate impression at all. She's only heard it once because my parents don't listen to the podcast partly because they don't even know how to get a podcast. Bless them. They're like, what is this podcast? Where do I get it on my phone?
What does it mean?
Don't worry, they're not for you. Yeah, exactly. But my uncle listens to it, and then one day we were having a barbecue, and he played Jordan's impression to my mum, and she did actually find it very funny, but William was mortified.
She's a good sport. Oh, bless her. Well, I think William's great. He's very, very funny. But yeah, it's just interesting to hear that, you know, you've both come into this media world coincidentally.
Hiya, it's Sophie from Made in Kent Radio. I know firsthand how hard it is to get into radio. You can't get experience without a radio reel. And you can't make a radio reel without having radio experience. Well, here at Made in Kent Radio, we're going to change that by offering you a professional radio demo pack. We'll help you produce a professional industry standard radio reel in our studios. And not only that, you'll get a 1 hour slot on a Sunday evening to test your skills. And we'll even put you on the roster to cover shows here at Made in Kent Radio. What's not to love? We have an exclusive discount code for Presently users too. That's PRES10. Head to madeinkent.co.uk to find out more, and we'll see you at the studios.
All right, so what would you say has been your career highlight so far?
Oh, good question. I suppose the most high-profile thing I've done would have been my Liz Truss interview last year. And I was lucky enough to be one of the 8 BBC local radio presenters who got the chance to interview her. And it was just one of those weird kind of all the events coming together in a certain way, in a way no one could have predicted. Because first of all, Liz Truss became Prime Minister, which no one necessarily was foreseeing. And then everything suddenly went very wrong quite quickly because the mini budget that her Chancellor did kind of unravelled and the pound was crashing. And then she hadn't done any media appearances. And because she had already in the diary that a lot of Tory leaders do before conference season, a round of local radio interviews, which is fair enough, makes sense, good way of getting out to voters across the country. She was booked in for it, and I was convinced she would cancel those interviews and do an interview on the Today program instead, but maybe she thought she'd get an easy ride from local radio.
I think she probably did, yeah.
She probably did, but if anything, it was a mistake because we were all like dogs with a bone, and when you're a politician, you can do that thing sometimes of going, oh, well, these questions, these are just liberal media elite questions that listeners don't care about. But when you're talking to local radio, it's harder to do that because we are in touch with our listeners. We're not on the big bucks. We live in our community. We hear from our listeners all the time. And so when we say, I said to her at one point, all this talk of pension funds going to the wall, can you guarantee to my listeners their pensions are safe? And she couldn't really. And, she can't turn around and say, well, you're some out of touch liberal media elite, because we're not. We hear from our listeners all the time. We're just putting the questions they want asked. And it was funny how it all blew up. And because it was the first time she'd really spoken in the wake of the mini budget, it got more media attention than your average. Local radio does do interview from time to time, but it just captured the attention of the media, really.
Yeah, it was all over Twitter. I remember going onto my Twitter feed and I didn't know she was doing this interview. And I remember seeing your name. And obviously I follow you on Twitter and know who you are, obviously, outside of this. But I kept seeing your name in tweets of people that aren't mutuals, and I was thinking, why is James doing this about? And I clicked on the link and I remember being sat in my living room with my housemate and I listened back to your interview and I was going like, go on, James, because I loved how you were sort of answering back to her and stuff, like not just like giving her an easy ride. And I think you're right, it's like that kind of people shouldn't underestimate BBC local radio just because it is local. It doesn't mean that it's any less or any, it's still journalists who have opinions, and actually, if anything, you might be able to say a little bit more of your opinion because you haven't got that big BBC One slot or something like that. You might be a little bit more cheeky with it. I don't know, that's what I thought.
Well, I think you can certainly it's a difficult one because obviously we're bound by the same BBC impartiality rules as anyone else, and but you have to ask the questions that the listeners want, and regardless of your politics, people were worried about what the economy was doing and they just wanted answers from their Prime Minister. And Liz Truss, I'm sure, has many political strengths, but communication probably wasn't her greatest strength. And I think that got showcased over the course of those interviews. The people were alarmed by her inability to kind of really respond to what was happening. And and I think local radio, there is a stereotype that it's all kind of gardening phone-ins and Alan Partridge types. And look, there is a bit of that, but equally, there can be that. And on one level, there's nothing wrong with that. But equally, there are some, proper journalists. And we were lucky because there are 40 BBC local radio stations and eight stations got the chance to do it. And the way it works is that basically Downing Street say to the BBC, look, we've got an hour of the Prime Minister's time. We'll split it into 8 slots, so about 7 or 8 minutes, and they will send basically a an offer round to all the local radio stations going, would you like to bid for one of these 8-minute slots for the Prime Minister? And funnily enough, because it's a good guest, pretty much every local radio station would have bid for that. And we were just one of the lucky 8. And, the other 80% of local radio probably would have just been missed out. But I know that any other local radio station who did those interviews would have done a great job, because every person who did an interview in their own way brought something to the table and asked questions their listeners wanted. So it was just one of those things. But I was when you see your name trending on Twitter, you're like, oh my God, this doesn't normally happen when you present a local radio show.
That must have been quite surreal to see it. And also, I did just like the fact that you were able to be a little bit like, she's just not answering. You're a bit like, no, but answer my question. Just give me an answer. And I like that, because I do feel like sometimes when you watch the big kind of political shows, I feel like the presenters are on a time limit. They might push, just sort of be like, oh God, we'll move on. But you were like, no, tell me the answer, which I quite liked.
Well, and actually, it's interesting because partly, it wasn't on a time limit, because you've got like a 7-minute slot, and so you've then got the next station dialing in, and if it's time, you can't overrun because it's unfair on them. So you're like, please just answer my question, because I need an answer. So that in a way kind of sped things along. Yeah.
What else has kind of stuck out to you, would you say, in the career? Because I know obviously you were around during lockdown. You were around during the Queen's death. I mean, I know that was announced it was an evening. So would you have been the following morning? You would have been the first show after that?
Yeah, that was very memorable, because there was a lot of talk as to, no one really knew how that all would play out when the Queen did die, even though, we'd sort of get briefing documents about this is what you do in the event of a Category 1 death, as they're known, which is basically just the biggest royals, at their passing, then you go into a Category 1 death situation. But we didn't really know when local radio would come back on air. Would it be the next day? Would it be the following Monday? Would we be off air for like a week? We just didn't know. And when her death was announced, I think it was like 6:30 or so on Thursday evening. It wasn't until about 9 p.m. on that evening that they said, okay, you're going to do breakfast tomorrow. And that was probably actually sooner back on air than I think I was expecting to be. But it meant that we were basically, that was when local radio came back on the Friday morning to reflect on the Queen's death. And that was I felt really privileged to be on the radio today, because you could tell that people were in a state of shock and kind of uncertainty, and she was such a momentous figure who was just such a constant. The vast majority of people listening would have only known the Queen as the monarch, and so true of me. And it was a weird time and a very sad time, and in a way that's where actually having local radio back on is really valuable, because our listeners have a close sort of bond with us. They feel connected to us because we are rooted in their community, and we've got a good relationship with our listeners, and so they kind of at difficult times you want to hear from a trusted person. But it was weird because we weren't playing any music, we weren't even doing jingles, because it was decided in the immediate aftermath it kind of our jingles are quite jazzy and upbeat. If you play that off the back of the Queen dying, it just isn't the right tone. So we have exactly. So you've got no jingles, no songs, 4 hours speak. And yes, we've got guests, and we've got the odd sort of pre-recorded obituary package about the times the Queen visited Bristol or whatever. But it was a challenging show, but rewarding at the same time. I came off air that day thinking that was a good show, and I've earned my money, because it was a big moment, and you've got to get the tone right, really.
Yeah, and does it make you nervous when you have situations like that? I suppose also with the Prime Minister, because I would be pretty nervous to do that. Do you get, first of all, do you get nerves on general day-to-day? You were on this morning, for example. Do you get normally nervous? And B, do you get more nervous for these sorts of situations?
I don't normally get nervous. I get sort of, I suppose, in a very slightly heightened state. So you've got a bit of kind of low-level adrenaline, I suppose, is the way of putting it. When I come off air, I do 4 hours, so 6 till 10. And when I come off air at 10, it's a long time. And sometimes my colleagues have a chat with me, and I feel like saying sometimes, without being rude, can I just have 10 minutes? Because you just your brain's been on like full throttle for 4 hours. It's just like you're mentally exhausted. Just give me a minute, And so you are you're not nervous as such normally with kind of your everyday show, but you're kind of slightly at a heightened state. You're aware you're on the radio. You're conscious you don't want to slip up. You're thinking about what you're saying. There are times when you're doing a really big show, maybe you're doing an outside broadcast, maybe you're Prime Minister, you are more nervous than normal. And certainly, for example, when I did my first breakfast show, I was absolutely cacking my pants because it's your first breakfast show and you don't want to knock it up. And when I did my first ever show on the radio, I was very, very nervous. And occasionally, weird things, occasionally you just have a day when you're really nervous. And I can't explain it. It might be a Thursday morning, normal show, and I suddenly have a pang of the nerves, and I don't know why.
That's funny, isn't
so it can just crop up on you. Yeah, but once you've done it a long time, the nerves do die down. But I think you're always slightly, there's always a slight level of adrenaline, which is good, because if you were completely unnervous, if you were too laid back, if you didn't care at all, then you probably wouldn't be doing the job.
No, and you'd probably end up saying things you don't want to say, I guess, if you really were like completely complacent with it.
I'm terrified of swearing on air. I've never done it before, but I'm terrified because the more relaxed you get and the more kind of it's a strange paradox, because on one level you don't want to be conscious that you're on air. The best conversation, the best interviews are where you almost disarm the person you're chatting to, and it's just like you're chatting down the pub or whatever, and that can often make the best radio. However, if you were chatting down the pub, you might throw in the odd F word, or you might start slagging someone off, or saying something you shouldn't say about someone or whatever, which you've also got to be, there's got to be part of you that's like, I'm still on the radio here, come on. So it's kind of got to straddle that line almost.
Yeah, absolutely. I've done one radio, as you know, I did from the sort of takeover thing that BBC Local Radio does offer once a year, or has done in the past, which is very nice. I did do my takeover on BBC Radio Bristol, and I remember feeling really, really, I only did an hour, you did 4, but you do 4 every day. I did 1 hour, and I remember feeling really like, oh my God, this is really intense, because I don't know if I'm going to say the wrong thing, or am I going to trip over my words? So it is something you do think about, right? You must think of still to this day.
Yeah, but that's completely natural. The first time I ever did a show on the BBC, any first, I've always been absolutely terrified. My first ever time I was cover presenting a show at BBC Radio Somerset, first time I was cover presenting a show at Radio Bristol, first time I covered the breakfast show, first time I was given a Saturday show, and it was like my show. For the first 3 months, every show I was really nervous. When I was given the breakfast show on that interim basis, pretty much for the first 6 months, I was getting slightly less nervous as it went on, but I was always in a heightened state of anxiety. That's just natural, and that's good, because it also shows you care. If you were just rocking up and completely chilled out from the get-go, you'd probably be either really arrogant, who just kind of rocks up there and thinks you could do it, or you'd just be a bit weird,
Yeah, absolutely. A bit weird. What's the hardest thing you would say about being a presenter or a broadcaster?
Oh, good question. I think, do you know what? I actually think being, and this is a terrible phrase, being your authentic self is hard. In the sense that it sounds really easy, and often the feedback you get when you're starting out is like, just be yourself, just relax a bit more. And it's really hard, because I thought I was being myself, and of course you are, but the more relaxed you can be, the more of yourself you can give, the more you don't have to talk about every single aspect of your life. That would be a bit weird, but you kind of want to share a bit with the listener. The more you share with the listener about your life and your personality and all that kind of stuff, the more they will get to know you and get to like you. And when I started out on sort of student radio, I was so loud and a bit shouty and a bit hyperactive, and probably a bit like that still now, to be honest. I'm still quite loud and quite sort of overly cheerful and whatever, but I was really turned up to 11. And I think I don't think I was doing that consciously. I think I was doing it subconsciously. But in a way, and that comes partly through experience, but being really natural, it is quite hard, because on one level, what you're doing, whether it's you, Esme, doing TV presenting, or, if it's radio presenting or whatever, it's the trick is to make it look natural, but that is quite hard, because there is an artifice to it. It's not normal to have a camera put in front of you or a microphone put in front of you. But if you can make it sound normal, make it sound natural, that's the difficulty. And you just it's just experience. It's practice. You get better at it.
Yeah, I'm sure. It's just doing things over and over again. You're always going to, like you say, it's with any industry, not just presenting. I guess any industry, you're going to get better the more you do it.
Yeah.
And I did want to mention, because obviously we talked about BBC Local Radio quite a lot, and the harder parts of being a presenter, and I think a lot of people will know, because it's in the news a lot, about how there's been lots of cuts within BBC Local Radio, and there's going to be some merging of shows, or stations I should say, isn't it? There's mergings of stations, and therefore there will be pending job losses. Does that sort of thing? Because I always think with presenting, you've got a full-time salaried BBC presenting job, but even then, there's always that kind of worry, I guess. Do you get sort of nervous for that kind of aspect of presenting?
I think you've always got to be aware of that. I mean, the first thing is, look, it's the nature of the industry that we're in. It is, the media is a fickle industry, and there will be times where you lose out on a gig. Either an employer says we want to move you, or we want to stop the show, or whatever it may be. That's going to happen. And I think, I've been very lucky so far in my career that hasn't really happened to me, but it will happen because it happens to everyone. And I think the key thing is to know it'll happen, to know it's personal, to know that if you're half decent and you work hard, hopefully there'll be other opportunities out there, and to be quite philosophical about it in a way. It's the nature of the industry. And, we've seen in the last year or so some massive changes on some big national radio stations of people moving and leaving and whatever. And if Ken Bruce, Steve Wright and Scott Mills and people can all move on, and okay, for various different reasons, and sometimes it was their own decision, and sometimes it wasn't, but then it can happen to anyone, and you've just got to accept that, really. The key thing is, I do think a good piece of advice is to always think of what you would do if your current gig came to an end. Always have a plan
really
B.
Good advice, yeah.
Even if you don't necessarily have to enact it, because it's hard to enact it when you're doing something else, but just to know in your mind what your plan B would be. Okay, so if my boss called me in tomorrow and said, thanks for taking you off air, what would my plan B be? That's quite a good thing to think of. And just, it's difficult because, of course, presenting is personal. You are putting yourself out there, and it feels more personal than if you just, work in a shop somewhere. It's that feels less personal than, here's me, do you like me? Do you still want me? No, you don't. It feels like a personal rejection, but you've kind of not got to see it that way and just understand that, things happen. And so I think it's a state of mind, and I think having a plan B is always a good mental kind of preparation for when inevitably at some point, something that you didn't want to happen will happen. Yeah,
because no one's going to be doing the job they're in till they're 90 years old, are they? Like there's always going to be some sort of changes, and you never know what's going to happen. So that's good advice. And in terms of obviously you do all your radio stuff, and obviously there's a bit of video content and online content which comes with it naturally. But in terms of getting into on-camera presenting, is that something that's ever interested you, doing television or doing digital content at all?
Do you know, it's funny. I to be honest, no, not massively. And I'm probably a bit unused in that, because I think, the way the media is, and I probably should need to change my attitude on this, because, and it's not that I'm against it at all. It's just that that's never necessarily been what's interested me. Going back to that little bedroom, it was the radio. That's what I loved. And, but increasingly everything is becoming multimedia. You look at the way that radio is being visualized now. So you look at the way LBC will tweet clips of their show, and people are being filmed in the studio. Anytime you've got a good guest in, they're being filmed in the studio. You look at the way the podcasts are visualized. You've sort of got to be multimedia, really. You've got to be able to present on the radio, the TV, event host, do digital stuff. So potentially because of what I do, because it is fundamentally radio, I just haven't had that many opportunities to do other stuff, and my love is radio. But I think it's interesting. I haven't had that much experience doing the other stuff, but I think long term that is the way the industry's going, and it's I'm going to have to adapt to.
Maybe that's something that's coming that you just don't know yet. Who knows? Maybe you'll be doing a lot of big stuff one day.
Maybe. Oh, I don't know. But I do think that it's something, any person starting out in the industry, whether they are more interested in TV or radio or digital or whatever, having a range of skills and being able to do a bit of everything is really important.
Yeah, for sure. Now, back on to sort of radio, have you ever had something that's gone dramatically wrong? Where you've been on air and something's gone really badly, or maybe, I don't know, you've asked a question and it's landed, but I don't know, whatever it might be. Have you ever had any sort of dodgy nightmare situations on air? Because it's been a long time.
I remember there was one last year where we just had a show where within about half an hour, everything conceivable that could go wrong did go wrong. First of all, the equipment failed. So literally the desk I have in front of me with all my buttons and faders where I play the music, and introduce guests, and my microphone and everything, basically everything bar my microphone failed. So I couldn't play any songs, I couldn't play any clips, I couldn't talk to a caller on the line. It was just me. And I had to just fill and waffle on for about 5 minutes. Then we get to the news, and thankfully the news presenter's microphone is working. So then during the news, I have to switch studios to go to our other studio, which thankfully was working, and start doing the show there. Then the next guest doesn't answer their phone, so I've just got to hang on for another 5 minutes. I've just used my 5 minutes of filler already, but I'm now doing another 5 minutes of filler, and then we get another guest on who then swears mid-interview and drops an F-bomb. Thankfully, we managed to get around it because there's never a good time for a guest to swear on air, but it was kind of more forgivable in the sense that she had won a Commonwealth gold medal, and was talking about her joy and saying she couldn't believe, I just effing won this and I can't believe it. And so it was kind of like a happy swear. And then what helped is that immediately she corrected herself and said, "Oh my God, I'm so sorry. I swore on the radio. I'm so sorry." So she apologised before I could even cut in and say. So that meant that all I had to do was basically wait for her to finish her sentence and say, "Look, I'm so sorry for the slightly fruity language. I hope you can understand, Lily's very happy at the moment. Heightened emotions, but apologies if you're offended." So, but in half an hour, having a guest that doesn't answer their phone, one that swears, equipment fails, everything that could go wrong kind of did. But it's radio. No one dies.
And I suppose it keeps learning, doesn't it? Because like you said earlier on, you can, I guess, get a bit complacent or stagnant if you do something for a long time. So maybe having things go wrong, having mistakes happen, kind of keeps you thinking, well, I actually have to keep on my game here, because otherwise I can handle this badly, maybe. Yeah. So what's your sort of... what's your kind of technique for handling when situations go wrong?
I think... First of all, this is where actually having experience really comes into it, because, when that happened last year, it didn't faze me too much because I'd been, but whereas 5 years ago, it would have really fazed me. And I think that's just the experience of, in the breakfast show, we have 90 minutes straight speech between 7 and 8:30 for a pure Ofcom reason. We're not allowed to play any music on local radio breakfast between 7 and 8:30,
really?
Which means
why
that because they think that we need to serve our audience with 90 minutes of all speech, all kind of local news for a window at breakfast. It's just one of those things. And I suppose there are justifications for it. But it does mean you've got to get good at filling and just talking, because if a guest doesn't answer their phone, okay, waffle on, And so once you have learned to do that, and there are tricks of doing it, slow down your pace of talk, not to an absurd degree. You don't want to start going all ridiculous, but... just take a minute, think about what you're saying. It is just experience. And I think also reassuring yourself that very often you can think that the listener is picking up on everything that's going wrong. The listener does, unless you let it show, they're not going to know that the guest doesn't answer their phone. Unless you let it show, they're not going to know that the equipment's failed. So just carry on, keep talking. You can do that. We can all talk. It's what we're there to do. And once you know that, okay, it might be unfortunate, but it's not the world, you can get through it.
Yeah, good advice, like that. Now, what does a typical day in the life look like for you in terms of what time do you have to get up? What time do you have to be at the BBC in Bristol? You go on live at 7. Was it 7 you said, or 6?
6 a.m. Yeah.
6 a.m. So 6 a.m. you go on live. What's your sort of typical day in the life, if there is one?
A lot of people have this perception that we just swan in at 5 to 6, and then we're on air at 6, and then we swan out the building at 10:05. And look, I'm sure there are some presenters who do that, but actually, that's not my style, because I'm a bit of a control freak, and I like to do a lot of prep. I like to know what's in the show. I like to read through any scripts we've got. I like to look at what's around on the day. Has anything broken overnight that we need to be reflecting in the programme? I like to look at what music I'm playing, all that kind of stuff. There's a lot more prep first thing than some people might realise. And then after the show, we'll have a bit of a break for half an hour. Then we'll have a team meeting with the producer and the reporters, and plan, okay, what stories we're going to cover on the show tomorrow, and which guests we want to get on, and start planning for the next day's show. So then I hang around doing planning for the next day until normally about sort of 12:30, 1ish or so. So I do an 8-hour day, really. The advantage is I get my afternoons to myself, but sometimes I'm sort of low energy in the afternoon because I've been up since 4 o'clock in the morning. But hey, it does mean I get my afternoons to myself, and it's not like I'm working down a mine, so I can't really complain.
And early bedtime, is it, I guess?
Early-ish. I mean, I go to bed at about 9, half 9. I'm not very good at napping in the afternoon. I just try and power through if I can, because if I do try and nap, I just wake up feeling more groggy. So, yeah, I mean, that is the thing. I mean, with breakfast, and obviously breakfast is a desirable gig on most radio stations, but it does take discipline. And if you're going to do it properly, you kind of have to take care of yourself. And, you know, it's not like you're a professional athlete, but you do need to, you know, not go to the pub stupidly late than before. You know, I know if there are nights where my mates will be like, do you want to go to the pub? And it's a weeknight. And I know I can have 2 or 3 and be fine just about. But if I know that even 3 pints the night before, even if I've gone to bed early, I can tell in my mind that my mind is operating at 2 miles an hour slower. And if you're doing an interview with Liz Truss or whatever, and your brain's not operating at 100 miles an hour, that can have an impact. So you've got to be a bit disciplined. You've got to make sure you get your sleep. You've got to make sure you go to bed at a reasonable hour, that you're not drinking loads the night before, that, you know, you're just trying to remain healthy in mind and body and that kind of stuff, as ridiculous as that sounds. You've got to take care of yourself, really, because when you get up at that hour of the day, particularly because people expect you to wake them up and be sort of on, as it were, at 6 a.m, you've got to do that.
Yeah, I don't know how you manage it. I'm so not a morning person in the slightest, so I just don't think I can.
Well, ironically, I'm not. I don't think I am at all either. I mean, I would always be more sort of evening orientated. I always think I have my better ideas in the evening. I think I'm more creative in the evening. I'm grumpy in the morning. Like my mum used to say, I was a teenager, absolutely foul coming down in the morning. Like even if I woke up at like 11 a.m. at the weekend, I'd still be absolutely foul. I'm just not good in the morning. But you just get used to it. You know, once you do it on a regular basis, you do get used to it, and coffee does help.
Your body clock must shift a bit. So where would you like your career to take you if you could have your kind of, I don't know, ultimate next 5 years or so?
I don't know, to be honest. I think I want to stay in radio, definitely, if I can, and I want to stay presenting. And, you know, I would love to get the chance one day to present on a national radio station. That would be the dream, I suppose. You know, if you do local, the obvious next step would be to try and do national. But that's hard, you know, and it's difficult, and it may never happen. Everyone wants to do it. It's a very competitive industry. And, you know, there's, for every one national radio station, there's 20 local radio stations, and not everyone can make that jump, and it may never happen. But you've got to be ambitious, and you've got to try and keep moving forward. So that would be an ambition. As for where that might be, who knows? And it depends if anyone would want me, really. But you know, that would be the aim, I suppose.
Oh no, I'd like to hear you on a national station. That'd be very nice to see that you've gone from. I'm always like, I like people who come from like the Bristol ends and make it, because you don't always hear Bristolians get to do that sort of thing. And I don't know, I just feel like it's nice to get more West Country people coming up to the national ranks. Always.
Yeah, big up the West.
Yeah, absolutely. So what would be your lasting piece of advice for sort of people who are watching this, who maybe are, some people who watch this might be brand new to presenting, some people might have done no presenting before, some people might have done loads but want to get into radio. What would be your advice for them?
I think you need a combination of luck, and I think you need to know that you need a combination of luck and hard work. Now, luck on one hand, you make your own luck. But accept the fact that you might look at somebody else. Don't compare yourself to other people is a massive piece of advice. You might look at someone else and go, hang on, why are they doing that? Like, you know, I've done everything that they've done and they've suddenly just got this lucky break. Stop comparing yourself to them.
Yeah.
And also, they just were in the right place, the right time, and their face fit or whatever happened, you know. And one day you'll get the luck as well. If you work hard and if you're half decent, you will get the luck as well. And it may not happen overnight. It may take years. But keep plugging away and you'll get that luck eventually. And yeah, it's hard work and it's putting yourself out there. And sometimes it can be a bit kind of demoralising in the media industry, because you put yourself out there, you send off demos, you email people and you get knocked back and you don't hear back, or you get a rejection or whatever. And you've almost got to become quite good at taking rejection and not taking it personally and being quite resilient with it, which is hard because no one likes rejection. No. But you've kind of got to accept that it's not personal, and you've got to keep plugging away and not lose faith in yourself, you know?
Well, James, thank you so much for chatting to us a little bit about your career and how you've got there, because it's really interesting to hear, you know, someone who's doing really well in local radio and how you got this. I know a lot of people have the aspirations to get into BBC Local Radio, so thank you very much. And I'm hoping you've dispelled anyone who thought you sounded like James Whippety Woo Hanson has now had that idea dispelled, if there's any listeners to the podcast out there. But thank you so much, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you, Esme. It's been really fun. Thank you.